Welcome back to Les Schwab Tire Center's Outdoor GPS, presented by Fisherman's Marine and Outdoor. Now it's time for your weekend tech tip, brought to you by Chevy Silverado.
Welcome back, everyone. We're going to talk drift fishing. Now, I know you've heard me talk about this over the years as being one of those techniques that is just overlooked, and there's a lot of reasons for that, and most of those reasons are good. Right now, I've personally been fishing with the float for steelhead as my primary way to go after them for well over 20 years. Now, that means that, yeah, I got away from drift fishing. Not entirely, but I definitely, like a lot of people, focused on fishing with the float. If it was bobber and jig, if it was bobber dogging, chandeliering, whatever it might be, that float is really part of the MO. That's just the way that a lot of us are doing it. And again, there's a lot of reasons for it. But if you overlook drift fishing as a weapon to use to target steelhead and salmon, you're costing yourself bites. You're costing yourself fish. Now, 100 years ago, it seems like, in the late 80s, 90, or right around 90, early 90s, we started doing a lot of free drifting out of sleds, okay? Basically what it was a hybrid way of drift fishing using the boat to just make you a rod holder. You'd cast up river a little ways, you'd sit there, make sure you're on the bottom, hold onto the rod, and and the guy running the boat's the one doing all the fishing, okay? But it was still drift fishing. You're dragging your gear along the bottom, you got a slinky or a pencilet or whatever it might be, bouncing along the bottom. Most of the time, your gear would actually be below. Make sure everybody hears that correctly. Most of the time, your gear would be below where your weight was, okay? Not always, but most of the time, that's drift fishing, okay? You might think that you're casting your gear out there and your lead is bouncing along the bottom and your gear is upriver. Well, it does do that sometimes, but that's not how it spins all of the time. The majority of it's actually below it. So you got to kind of think about that a little bit. Okay, here's the basic setup. Here's the basic rigging for drift fishing. Now, the reason why I kind of talked quickly about we started drift fishing out of a boat, free drifting, is that it changed how a lot of us would rig, and Joel kind of alluded to this, changed how a lot of us would rig our drift fishing setup when we're on the bank, which is what this setup is here, or also the same thing that we would do if we're free drifting in our boats, if it's a drift boat or a power boat, whatever it might be. This is a fixed setup, meaning that I've got my slinky on here, a swivel. This is a snap swivel, of course. This is the main line side, and then this is the leader side. Now, what that means is that this is not going to slide up and down your main line. Now, what Joel was referring to earlier was just having a a barrel swivel, and then a bead, and then your slider going up and down your main line. Here's the reason why we kind of got away from that. It does fish just fine. It does fish in a way that you're going to be able to feel everything just right. But with that sliding movement, casting could sometimes have been a challenge when you're casting a longer leader, like what we were doing out of the boats most of the time. So in the end, it became just common practice to do it that way. So there are two setups. You can let that lead slide up and down your main line, or have it fixed just like this. This is how I fish it. I don't see any reason why I would ever go back to having that sliding setup, but don't get me wrong, there's a reason why we did it that way forever. I did as well. That's how I grew up doing it. This is just a much more, it's just full contact, I guess is a better way to put it. And I really like slinkies, okay? Now, pencil lead has its place, of course, because the feel of pencil lead is immediate. I mean, you feel every little tick, 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 tick down there. But when we started fishing with braided line, as our main line, I really appreciated slinkies because they were a little bit less grabby than pencil lead, okay? And it was something that I could change multiple sizes to get down or lighten that weight up. So for shallower water or slower water, much easier, much faster. Again, that's arguable because there's different ways that you can do your pencil lead by having multiple different lengths, punching holes in them. Myself, we just would have a slinky party and do about 10 years worth of slinkies in a day and call it good. Now, here's the other end of it. This is just a basic setup. This is Yarny with one of the Oregon tackle little egg clusters here. I love them. They're just really, really pretty. But this is just one of any countless different baits that you can fish back there. You could have just straight eggs, a Corky and eggs. You could have your egg cluster with eggs on top of it. Just a straight Corky if you wanted to, just a straight bead. Pink worm is one of my favorite things to drift fish, especially if I've already gone through an area a handful of times and I want to make that last pass through as we're drifting away. I'll throw a pink worm in, dragging it along the bottom with the drift fishing setup. So, I mean, there's just any number of different baits that you can fish back there. So that's the rigging, though. So don't overthink this. If you're going to use braided line, you know, tie right to it, of course. If you're going to be using mono, you tie right to it. It's not a big deal. You're just going to get a different feel out of mono as opposed to braid when you're drift fishing. You want to be able to feel everything. You want that tick, 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 tick along the bottom. When you make that cast upriver a little ways, a small 45-degree angle, let that gear get down and hit the bottom. Once you lock over and your lead is starting to drag along the bottom, you want to be able to feel all that, right? There will be times where your lead or your slinky is going to come up off the bottom. It's going to just feel soft and spongy. That's when you can dump a little bit of line, let that lead get back to the bottom, because that's where you wish to be. You don't want to be up off the bottom. You want to feel the bottom the entire drift. And you'll start to get a little bit of experience with it. If you start feeling that it's just hanging up a little bit more, you can tighten things up, lift your rod tip to kind of lift that lead off the bottom so that you can get through drifts or then start playing with lead size. But here's the biggest trick. Oh, before I go too far, I've got this actually tied on a spinning rod setup, and that was part of the question with the original question from the individual up north, is which rod and reel setup. If they're new at it, I wouldn't recommend a bait caster because that does take a little bit of time and practice to get used to. That's the only way that I drift fish is with from the bank, is with a bait caster. If I'm in the boat, though, I do use a spinning rod setup. Again, both of which are going to have 30-pound braid on there. The X8, or excuse me, yeah, the Braid 8 from P-Line in particular. I love that stuff. But in the end, it's just one of those things that once you make those casts, right, and you start to feel what that feel is, because it's all about the feel. Listen, I know that it's impossible for me to express that here in a studio, but when you start feeling the bottom, which you are already doing, if you're bobber dogging in what some would call a traditional way, where your gear is dragging along the bottom and being pulled by that float, okay, you're already dragging the bottom. You're not feeling it because that belly in your line and all that stuff, but that's actually accomplishing a very similar thing. Now you're just taking it away from that float and you're putting all that feel in your hand, and now you're going to be able to start manipulating what that bait will do. And it won't take you long to understand, especially in different scenarios, different situations, on how you can actually manipulate the bait, put it in a spot where the fish actually should be, although fish can spread out, but there's certainly spots where those fish should be, little trenches, behind rocks, behind structure, whatever it is. And you will lose baits, all right? You will break leaders. That's one of the reasons why float fishing is so popular. But when you get into deep or faster water, dragging along the bottom drift fishing is significantly more, I shouldn't even say that because there's ways that you can do it. It's extremely effective. It's one of those things where people can bobber dog through it, not touch a thing. You go right back through, locked on the bottom, dragging your gear through, and all of a sudden you're getting bites where they're not. So it is certainly something to keep in mind. I looked last night to see if I could find any like YouTube videos or anything that talks specifically about this, and I could not find one, which shocked me. I was absolutely floored. Anyway, there you go. There's your Chevy Silverado Tech Tip of the Week. When we come back, I'm going to have Jack Glass from the river live. They're out chasing some steelhead. I've got several questions and calls that are coming up. After that conversation with Jack, we're going all phone lines. So everyone that's on hold now, be patient. We'll be back with more Outdoor GPS in just a minute.
Outdoor GPS is brought to you by Chevy Silverado and the impressive new TurboMax engine. Flex your muscle with the strongest, most advanced Silverado ever. Official truck of Outdoor GPS.